Hello philosophy students. Today we'll be going over the consequences of Moral Law 1. So what is Moral Law 1? Moral Law 1 is that we recognize that God, creator of human nature, exists, thus determines what is right and wrong. And there are inherent consequences when moral law is not kept. Put a lot of emphasis in that inherent. You'll soon later see why. And we already determined that man's nature is to actively seek the good. And the absence of good is evil. So how do you not keep Moral Law 1? The first step is neglecting. And this is done by not regarding or actively seeking God. Making something that is clear about God not clear. Disbelief, you might say, and this is basically doing what is not right. And then there's avoidance, which is basically increasing of the evil through the use of self-deception. You could say avoidance is self-deception. And then you resist, making the evil ever increasing by self-justification. Self-justifying why you do not need reason or why you neglect reason. So you could also say resisting is self-justification. And denial is the worst part. It's when you shut eyes to rational reasoning. You become irrational, and this is ultimately leading you to self-destruction. And this leads to spiritual death, meaninglessness, boredom, and guilt. Now if you're having a hard time understanding, we could use a good example, which is guilt. Suppose you didn't study for a test instead of studying, so you decide to cheat instead. You'll feel guilty afterwards. And then there's what if you get into an argument with your parents? Instead of admitting to your fault, you choose a bad alternative, which will make you feel even more guilty, just lying. And then suppose you have an argument with your friends. Instead of apologizing, you just push them away. And all this guilt will build up inside you, and you'll sooner or later deny that you're guilty, saying you're fine when you're really not. So the consequence of this guilty, it's cumulative. It could eventually be too heavy to bear, and many people commit suicide at that point. So you compare the suicide as spiritual death in a more modern example. Alright, so let's go back to it. Neglecting, not actively seeking God, disbelief, you could say. Avoidance is self-deception, resisting is self-justification, and denial is self-destruction, becoming irrational, and shutting one's eyes to rational reasoning. So now let's talk about spiritual death, meaninglessness, boredom, and guilt. So some people would say spiritual death is hell, a place where it's burning, and the devil's always torturing you, and you're in complete torment for all of eternity. That's a pretty good idea, but really, hell is life without meaning, or death without meaning. After all self-destruction, self-denial, you leave a meaningless life where you do not actively seek the good, and because you do not actively seek the good, the evil will forever ever be increasing. And when death comes, we lack the good, which means we'll lack all the meaning in our death, leaving us with just emptiness. An absolute absence of the good is spiritual death. So good, you can't really describe how spiritual death is, because it's the worst thing that could ever happen to you. But a good example is like the darkness, like walking into the darkness, being ever so alone. So when you do not actively seek the good, the light, you're just walking through the darkness, always feeling alone, be guilty, ever increasing in the evil, and really you'll just be tormented by your own guilt and your own meaninglessness for the rest of eternity. So a summary of it is the consequence of living according to rational beings' nature is to live a life full of meaning. And humans, since we are finite, can be ever increasing in either the good or evil. And human nature can be known because it is grounded in what is real and what is clear to reason. So do not neglect, avoid, resist, or deny. So do not stray away from moral law 1. Meaninglessness and boredom and guilt becomes the bottomless pit that we call hell. And the consequences of not keeping moral law 1 is spiritual death. And a little side note before I end is that we only live once, and we should at least live a life filled with meaning. So we should actively seek the good, because we can either choose to be ever increasingly empty or ever increasingly increasing with the good. And always use reason to figure out what is the good. And thank you for watching.